Random House Audio presents The Great Derangement, a terrifying true story of war, politics, and religion at the twilight of the American Empire, by Matt Taibbi. This is David Slavin. Born Again. It's a Thursday afternoon in San Antonio, and I'm in a rented room. Creaky floorboards, peeling wallpaper, month to month, no lease, space heater only, the ultimate temporary lifestyle. And I can't find the right channel on the television. I rented this place, it seems, without making sure that it had ESPN. This realization throws the poverty of the room into relief for the first time. Shit, it's cold in here, I think. Aware of a draft all of a sudden. When I look back at the TV, it's on a gospel channel. A video preacher straight out of Central Casting is pointing a finger right at the screen, right at me, admonishing me to surrender to God. He's got swept-back white hair, gold wire-rimmed glasses, and a booming hellfire voice that makes the name Abraham come spilling out of his mouth like a brand-new Mustang V8 turning over for the first time. "When you give up more than you deserve," he shouts, "God will give you more than you dreamed." He pauses, letting the words settle in for effect. "I want you to write that down somewhere." I shrug and reach for a notebook. "Write it down. When you give up more than you deserve," the preacher repeats, "God will give you more than you dreamed." I nod and write it down in block letters. Why not? I have no idea what the hell it means, but I didn't come to Texas to argue with people. But what exactly do I deserve? The preacher continues on. His sermon is from Genesis 12, the story about Abraham coming to Egypt and instructing his beautiful wife, Sarah, to say that she's his sister, which in turn allows Abraham not only to avoid being killed, but to trade her to Pharaoh in exchange for a motherload of slaves, asses, and camels. But as things like this always do in the Old Testament, this unlawful union brings a plague on Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh finds out the reason, he is pissed, screaming to Abraham, "Why saidst thou, she is my sister? Therefore, behold thy wife, take her, and go thy way." At which point Abraham and his people leave, and a few chapters later he gets to go into the tent of his wife's handmaiden Hagar and make a baby with her. It seems like a great deal for Abraham. Avoid execution, get a great trade-in deal for your wife, then bang her handmaiden. But I'm not sure I see where the lesson about deserving and dreaming is here. No such problem for Pastor John Hagee. "You see, it happened to Abraham. It can happen to you," he shouts. "Nothing is impossible to those who have faith." Down at the bottom of the screen, there's a notation. Prayer line, 210-490-5100. I write that down, too, marking it with a smiley face. The show ends shortly after that, and another, less talented preacher, his Carrot Top-esque shtick is preaching seated at a desk, comes on and starts babbling about the Christian children in the Sudan being kidnapped at birth and forced to convert to Islam. Here in South Texas, everyone for 500 miles in every direction is a Christian, but they're constantly finding ways to think of themselves as a besieged minority. You hear a lot about our oppressed brothers and sisters in Africa, India, the Middle East. They're ideal objects of sympathy because they're helpless, they're poor, and it would take them at least 20 years to reach San Antonio even if they started swimming today. Anyway, I hit the mute button, lean back in my chair, look around at my shitty room, and sigh. It's December 2006, and I'm now on hiatus, after spending the whole fall covering the midterm elections for my depraved liberal magazine, Rolling Stone. I'm here in Texas to work out the answer to a question that has been germinating in my mind for some time, and which came to a head after the elections. Back in the East Coast media world where I come from, an ugly place where nothing grows but scum, lichens, and Jonathan Franzen, the sweeping electoral victory by the Democrats was greeted with a tremendous sigh of relief, as if it were a sign that our endlessly self-correcting, essentially centrist American polity had finally come to its senses. In that world, there was optimism because the people had finally derailed that nutty Bush revolution, because the country had apparently seen the light about a pointlessly bloody and outrageously expensive war in Iraq, and because the cautious yuppieism of the Democratic Party had been triumphantly rehabilitated, at least temporarily quelling the potentially internationally embarrassing specter of terminal one-party rule. The pendulum was swinging back. Yin was morphing back into yang. American politics moved in cycles, and the latest conservative cycle had finally ended. The election results were being sold, in other words, as a triumph of the American system, of American democracy. Just like the producers for Monday Night Football, the country's political elite likes things best when the teams are evenly matched. As far as the press was concerned, the best thing about the Democratic bounce back in the midterms was that it set up a great 2008. Even odds, or maybe Dems -1 to reach the White House. American politics had never been in better shape. I knew better. I had been all around the country in the last year, and I knew that the last thing these elections represented was a vote of confidence in the American system. Out there, in states both blue and red, the people were boarding the mothership, preparing to leave this planet for good. The media had long ignored the implications of polls that showed that half the country believed in angels and the inerrancy of the Bible, or of the fact that the Left Behind series of books had sold in the tens of millions. But on the ground, the political consequences of magical thinking were becoming clearer. The religious right increasingly saw satanic influences and signs of the upcoming apocalypse. Meanwhile, on the left, a different sort of fantasy was gaining traction, as an increasing number, up to a third of the country according to some polls, saw the Bush crime family in league with Al-Qaeda, masterminding 9/11. Media outlets largely ignored poll results that they felt could not possibly be true, like a CBS News survey that showed that only 16% believed that the Bush administration was telling the truth about 9/11, with 53% believing the government was hiding something, and another 28% believing that it was mostly lying. Then there was a stunning Zogby poll taken just in advance of the 2004 Republican convention that showed that nearly half of New York City residents, 49.3%, believed that the government knew in advance that the 9/11 attacks were coming and purposely failed to act. Not only did voters distrust the government's words and actions, by 2007 they also had very serious doubts about their government's legitimacy. Successive election cycles foundering on voting machine scandals had left both sides deeply suspicious of election results. A poll in Florida taken in 2004 suggested that some 25% of voters worried that their votes were not being counted, a 20% jump from the pre-2000 numbers. More damningly, a Zogby poll conducted in 2006 showed that only 45% of Americans were very confident that George Bush won the 2004 election fair and square. The most surprising thing about that last poll was the degree to which the distrust was spread wide across the demographic spectrum. That 71% of African Americans distrusted the 2004 results was perhaps not a surprise, given that black voters in America have been victims of organized disenfranchisement throughout this country's history. But 28% of NASCAR fans, 25% of born-again Christians, 32% of currently serving members of the armed forces, these are astonishing numbers for a country that even in its lowest times, after Watergate, say, or during Reconstruction, never doubted the legitimacy of their leaders to such a degree. And if distrust of the government was at an all-time high, that was still nothing compared to what the public thought of the national media. Both the left and the right had developed parallel theories about the co-opting of the corporate press, imagining it to be controlled by powerful unseen enemies, and increasingly turned to grassroots internet sources for news and information. In the BBC Reuters Media Center's annual Trust in the Media survey in 2006, the United States was one of just 2 countries surveyed, Britain being the other, where respondents trusted their government, 67%, more than they trusted national news reporters, 59%. A Harris poll that same year showed that some 68% of Americans now felt that the news media were too powerful. The country, in other words, was losing its shit. Our national politics was doomed because voters were no longer debating one another using a commonly accepted set of facts. There was no commonly accepted set of facts. except in the imagination of a hopelessly daft political and media elite that had long ago lost touch with the general public. What we had instead was...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?